Hi, I'm Mr. eTutor, your mystery tutor here at mysterytutor.com, and welcome to video module 6-14. This video module is all about debunking one of the greatest myths about the SAT math section, and that myth is the so-called order of difficulty. Almost every SAT teacher will tell you that math questions get progressively harder within a math section. And, from a certain perspective, there's a little bit of truth to this. But from a practical perspective, there's absolutely none. What do I mean when I say there's a little bit of truth to this, but not much practical truth at all? Well, let's talk about that for a second. It's true that the College Board assigns every single question on its tests a difficulty ranking from 1 to 5, with 5 being the most difficult and 1 being the least difficult. It's also true that on the math section, the questions generally start out as 1s and generally end up as 5s, and there's a general trend of getting more difficult as the section goes on. But the problem here is the assumption that the College Board's ranking system means anything to you, an individual test taker, and in fact it doesn't. You see, the College Board ranks a question's difficulty simply by looking at how many students miss the question when the question is given to a test group of students. So the difficulty level tells you nothing about how you might do when you answer a question. Instead, it only tells you what the average student does when the average student answers a question. But you're not an average student, you are you. So it doesn't really matter what everybody else does when they look at a particular question. If everyone who takes a test answers number 7 correctly and number 18 incorrectly, but you answer 7 incorrectly and 18 correctly, then for you, 7 was harder than 18, even if everybody else found it the other way around. So there's no point at all worrying about the difficulty of a particular question on the SAT math section. I strongly encourage you to drop the idea that math questions get harder as you move through the section. In fact, I would argue in a lot of ways, math questions get easier as you move through a section. Yes, that's correct. The further you move through the section, the more abstract the questions become, and the less calculation heavy they become in general. In earlier modules, we've already looked at a couple of solutions to questions that were the last questions in their section, and that were extremely susceptible to particular SAT standards. If you turn to page 400 in your copy of the official SAT study guide written by the College Board, you'll see another example of exactly what I mean. Page 400 includes questions 18, 19, and 20 from the very first math section of the very first sample test in the College Board's book. All 3 of these questions are considered hard questions that most students answered incorrectly. But every single one of these questions can be answered in only moments without picking up a pencil. Not only that, but questions 19 and 20 have answer choices that are vulnerable to the 2 standards that we discussed in earlier modules. 19 is vulnerable to the grouping standard, and 20 is vulnerable to the factor of 2 standard. If you'd like to see some examples of the best ways to solve these questions, as well as other SAT math questions, please check out the Answer Vault. Look for the link to the right-hand side of your screen. Here's a tip for number 19, though. As complicated as 19 might look, try the grouping standard. If you prefer not to use the grouping standard, you can substitute the number 12 for the letter N in each answer choice and see which answer choice solves out. This approach will take you approximately 5 seconds. Now remember, each of these 3 questions is supposedly among the hardest questions in the entire section, but each can be solved without even using a pencil or a calculator. Other questions earlier in the section, however, would be almost impossible to solve without a pencil, so I submit to you that in at least one way, the questions towards the end of the section tend to be easier. What I mean by that is that, as we've just seen, the questions towards the end of the section tend to involve much less calculation than the questions towards the beginning of the section. So remember, you can go ahead and scrap the order of difficulty idea. Instead, replace it with the idea that questions become more abstract and less calculation intensive as you move through a section. That doesn't necessarily make them easier or harder, it just means you need to adapt your approach a little bit as you go through a section. If you miss question 16, it doesn't mean that 17 will have to be even harder. 17 has no bearing on 16, and vice versa. Okay, so that's it for the order of difficulty. Enjoy the rest of the video modules, and remember, it's easier than you think.